Hi everyone, welcome to our first lecture. Today we'll be talking about a scientific understanding of behavior and more broadly all kinds of different outcomes. So when we talk about the term research methods, what I want us to think about is how broadly it can be applied. So this idea of research and how research is conducted is becoming important. I shouldn't say is becoming, has been important for various sectors of society, especially over the past couple hundred years, especially since kind of the Enlightenment period where people started using the scientific method to ask important kinds of questions. In this course, we'll be talking a lot about research that's done in universities and the kind of research that I do. So we can kind of think about how research methods gets applied and used to ask kind of social questions and issues that kind of everyday people have to confront and those sorts of things. So we can think about first how research methods are used in guiding public policy, so in government, and also making decisions in the courts. So the Supreme Court makes, kind of really overarching laws that the society is guided by, and oftentimes these decisions are informed by research. One example of this is thinking about when a adolescent can be charged as an adult for their serious violent crimes. Developmental psychologists have asked this question for a long time. When is a adolescent an adult in the sense that they can be held accountable for their actions when it comes to serious crimes such as homicide and murder? So the Supreme Court has used findings from different kinds of researchers, specifically developmental psychologists, to inform them about how to make decisions. This is also true when we're talking about eyewitness testimony in a court. So potentially we need to be careful if, let's say we have a eyewitness that saw a crime and their testimony might actually be valid, or it might, kind of be marred or made questionable because of the emotions they experienced during witnessing the crime. Maybe they have alternative motives or associations with the defendant and those kinds of things. So using an understanding of science allows us to better judge the validity of these kinds of kind of eyewitness accounts. In another area where research methods are really important is the assessment of programs. So thinking about program evaluation, which we'll talk about later, this idea that billions and billions of dollars are put into different kinds of social programs, and we need to make sure that these dollars are being spent effectively. So thinking about the Meals on Wheels program, where nutritious meals are delivered to homebound older adults, and also people that have kind of severe limitations that prevent them from leaving their houses. So this is a primarily grant-funded operation, and this money is coming from tax dollars. So even taxpayers want to know whether delivering meals to older adults actually helps increase the health of these older adults, makes them healthier for longer. Also prevents them from, maybe having kind of social isolation and things like depression. So what we want to do is we need to develop ways to measure whether the program of Meals on Wheels is an effective way to prevent decline in health in older adults. And the way that we do this is through the use of research methods. So outside of this sort of public sphere that I've been talking about, research methods can be used both to benefit personal decision-making as well as business decision-making. So as an individual, we're increasingly confronted by complex information. So just thinking about maybe if you read the New York Times or Google News, how much information we are exposed to every day. This information comes from all sorts of different kinds of news outlets. Some of them are very much politically motivated. Some of them are as objective as possible. Now, it's hard to determine this sometimes. So really what we need to do is build a toolkit of ways to think about research that allows us to really get a sense of whether they're valuable or not, whether they're truthful or not. Also just in the terms of making kind of really everyday decisions, so maybe what kind of car should I purchase? There's a lot of information that we can get online about different kinds of different variables related to a car purchase. So thinking about cost, fuel efficiency, safety ratings, also these things that are a little bit harder to qualify, kind of like whether we think a car is cool or not. But taking all of these different things into account requires sort of a rational approach to making a decision rather than just sort of impulsively buying the first Camaro that's on the lot because we think it's a pretty color or something. So we really need to be able to use kind of trained rational logic to make decisions, and hopefully that's what I can help develop in the course this semester. Now, thinking about how research methods are applied to business, this is where I kind of hope to give you a sense of how valuable understanding research methods is for your career, because many of you are going to go on to careers in business where decision making is increasingly driven by data. So if you're at all interested in technology, data collection, and those kinds of things, you've heard the job title of data scientist. So data scientists are very popular, especially in Austin because we have so many tech firms. But a data scientist is really just a statistician that focuses their knowledge and understanding on business issues. And a lot of their research questions are related to things like marketing, purchasing behavior, and that sort of stuff. Really, this all begins with research methods being able to identify a meaningful causal association between a specific kind of behavior and an outcome that we're interested in, specifically purchase, whether or not somebody made a purchase. So using research methods is critical in business to guide the decision making of kind of executives, CEOs, and that kind of thing, to help them make the best decisions and make the most profit for their shareholders and investors and that kind of thing. So what we learn in this class, while it will be specifically focused on social science, because I'm a social scientist and we're in a kind of a social science environment right now, know that these tools can be applied to a wide variety of different kinds of settings and questions. So thinking about knowledge, so very general, what philosophers call epistemology, kind of this way of knowing. There's ways that are more reliable and more trustworthy than others. So let's start with these kinds of ways of just, the sense that we know something because we just believe it to be true. We've never really questioned it. One way that this happens is through this idea of intuition. So intuition relies really on personal judgment, and this can be based upon, anecdotal evidence. So you're starting to see associations between things, so you believe that they're truly associated. Also things like, wisdom passed down through generations. So, a lot of times I talk to my dad about, investment, money kinds of things. And a lot of the time his understanding is based upon intuition and experience. And a lot of time it actually works out to be true, but a lot of cases it doesn't turn out to be true, right? Because this was not based upon any kind of rational decision making. It was based upon this is that gut instinct, and this is kind of going on intuition. So while intuition can be very valuable, it does involve a lot of cognitive and motivational biases. So one of the kind of primary ways that intuition is developed erroneously is through this idea of illusory correlation. So illusory correlation happens when we observe two events happening at the same time. So we establish somehow that they're related. So imagine that, maybe this morning I went to, Torchy's Tacos and got a specific kind of breakfast taco. Afterwards, let's say that I got into a fender bender, so I rear-ended somebody. Potentially I could blame, I could kind of think, well, I usually don't go to Torchy's and eat breakfast tacos, and I usually don't rear-end somebody on my way to work, so maybe going to Torchy's did something to me, maybe the tacos are just too fatty and they made me have a slow reaction time, or, we could come up with all of these sort of explanations as to why eating Torchy's tacos caused me to get in a car wreck on the way to work. Unfortunately, this example would prevent me from enjoying Torchy's tacos and might also increase the risk of me rear-ending somebody for no other reason. Maybe not so much on the second account, but you can kind of see what I'm getting at is when we kind of think about like a lucky sort of thing. So if you've ever played craps at a casino, a lot of people will blow on the dice before they throw the dice. This is an example of illusory correlation. Like we know that somebody blowing on the dice isn't going to have any meaningful impact on the numbers that are thrown, but this is just something that in our culture we've established that we think can actually have an impact. So a lot of illusory correlation. You can think about examples of when people think they have like a lucky pair of socks or some kind of pre-game ritual. These kinds of things are really just intuitive, but sometimes non-meaningful ways of knowing things. Another way that we come to know what we do and kind of believe what we do is through authority. So authority is a very broad kind of means through which people establish power over one another. And, we can kind of think up at the different levels of authority that we kind of live under or live with, as we can think of the economy, we can think of the government, we can think of religion. Then we can also think of like the news media generally, people that are writing, things that are on, Twitter now, the internet, government officials. So all of these different figures who have power, sometimes legitimately have power. So we can say that, the President of the United States has legitimate authority because they were elected president. And sometimes we have these political pundits, these people that just because they are charismatic, because they, speak loudly, that they develop authority over individuals. So we have a large group of people believing somebody that just sort of comes up with, nonsense a lot of the time. So authority is something that, as a sociologist, which I've told you my background is very interesting to me, because a lot of times people bow to authority simply because that's what they've been told to do, because they're scared of consequences and that kind of thing, even if what that authority is telling them is false. So you can think a lot of what's going on, in politics, even sometimes science. We'll talk about pseudoscience later. This happens a lot, so it's really important for us to question authority. So like I've said, authority is sometimes very corrupt, because once somebody has power, they want to maintain power. The reason they have power is because they have special interests, so thinking about lobbyists in Washington. So a lot of times power can be corrupting. So what we need to do is actually use these tools that we're going to learn throughout the semester to question authority. So the scientific approach really rejects the notion that authority is true just because the person making the statement is in a position of authority. And it requires us to really find, evidence that supports decisions and conclusions and statements before we can really trust an individual, and that's something that I really hope I can help establish if that's not something that you already do. So if somebody tells you something, that happened in the news, or, maybe the relationship between the United States and China is deteriorating, before you believe them because you either trust that person or they told you that they heard it, maybe through either the New York Times or Fox News or, whoever it is on that like political spectrum, really do the research yourself and try to find evidence that either supports or refutes those claims. So talking about another way of knowing, and this is why we're here, is we really want to talk about the scientific approach. You've probably been taught this before. Everybody knows, at least has been exposed to the concept of the scientific method. And that's what we're talking about here, is really the scientific method, which is composed of skepticism, empiricism, falsifiability, and peer review. And all of these things are really related. So we've talked so far about skepticism, this idea that you should always question knowledge, right? So question people's decisions based upon that are based upon intuition, authority, and those kinds of things. So this skepticism is just always being, always questioning, always being skeptical. And some people have actually, kind of framed this in a negative light. So somebody that's always skeptical, oh, they're never happy, they never trust anybody. And skepticism can be, maybe a bad thing when it's overused. But this idea that you should always look into the question yourself, you should always, be a little bit untrusting of different kinds of claims of knowledge, I think is very powerful, and something that it shouldn't be looked down upon for somebody to be skeptical. I think that's one of the first kind of indications of somebody's kind of wisdom and knowledge, is that they're skeptical of authority, especially skeptical of intuition, skeptical of these things that maybe they've always believed and they don't know why. Second is empiricism, and we've talked a little bit about this. Empiricism, and you can kind of think of empirical methods as ways of establishing knowledge that are just based upon observation. So we're always measuring something, we're always collecting data, we're always analyzing data. So empirical methods are those where data is collected, and we'll talk a lot about empirical research methods throughout the semester. And that's what this means, is the research is actually based on collecting data and collecting observations about the questions and the ideas that are of interest, not using somebody else's statements as truth. Next, we have falsifiability. So falsifiability is kind of the balance of skepticism. So you can imagine somebody skeptical of everybody else's statements. Falsifiability is this idea that you should be skeptical of your own statements and your own beliefs. So science should be falsifiable in the sense that if I conduct a research study, let's use this example of Meals on Wheels again. So if I conduct a research study on, maybe individuals that have signed up for Meals on Wheels, I think if I give them a iPad that is filled with all sorts of pictures of, puppies and kitties, that it's going to make them happier, right? Which, who doesn't think pictures of puppies and kitties would not make anybody happier? But let's say that we do some kind of intervention where we give 100 older adults an iPad full of these pictures, and then we measure their depression scores before they receive the iPad and after they receive the iPad. Maybe we actually do find a relationship where people that receive the iPads had lower depression scores than others who did not receive these iPads with pictures of cute kittens. One thing that I would want to do is not say that because I found a relationship between the cute pictures and depression, I don't want to say that that relationship is true, that that it's um, unrefutable, that nobody can question it. What I want to do is to make sure that there actually is a relationship between those things. So what I want to do is talk to other scientists and ask them to critique my work, right? So have them say, what did I do wrong? Where are my limitations in this study? That's really important in science, is that people need to be open to criticism. And this is, I think, probably important in everyday life too, is being open to criticism and actually hearing what other people have to say and using that to inform your decision making and make better decisions in the future. You can also kind of think of this as, when I think about science, a lot of times I think about debates. So you've seen political debates on television, maybe or participated in a debate club in high school. Debate is very much based upon kind of the scientific method, as well as other kinds of ways that this intuition and authority are integrated. But I find it fascinating. But in this falsifiability, in a debate, somebody should be open to the person they're debating critiquing their ideas and showing them where their logic and where their understanding of a specific problem might be wrong, right? This is also related to peer review. So peer review is kind of this formal mechanism through which this idea of falsifiability happens. So peer review is when a study is evaluated by other scientists in a formal process. So imagine that I published, or I wrote a paper on my findings about the relationship between cute puppy pictures and depression in older adults. I would submit this paper to a scientific journal where hopefully 3 or more scientists who have expertise in this area would then critique my work and say what I did wrong, and also hopefully say some good things too, right? It's not usually helpful to be just completely negative. But this is that process of peer review where we allow other people to review our work, and this is really where we open up that idea of falsifiability and also that skepticism. We're skeptical of our own work. We want to know what other professionals, what other experts have to say about our work. And maybe as I've kind of, I don't know, informally said, science is really this integration of intuition, authority, skepticism, empiricism, falsifiability, peer review. It's kind of all mixed together, right? So our ways of knowing are not distinct from one another. There's a lot of overlap. So if you could kind of think about something like, a Venn diagram where we have one circle here. Oops, I didn't mean to draw that line there. Representing skepticism, and then we have this one circle here representing empiricism, and then we have this one circle here representing falsifiability. You can see that we end up having a lot of overlap, and this kind of holds true also with those kind of non-scientific ways of talking, or knowing, I should say, thinking about intuition and authority. So there's a lot of overlap with these kinds of ways of knowing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's an important thing I should note too, is by setting up this comparison of intuition with the scientific method, it doesn't mean that intuition is not important, because it's extremely important and oftentimes is correct. But when we're actually looking to answer questions, what we need to do is be able to use a scientific approach, a rational approach, that can, in the end, really give us proof of whether there is a relationship between items, or there are differences between these groups. So the scientific method in an ideal use, and kind of like if everybody used the scientific method, we would have a lot more truth around us. We'd be exposed to a lot more or more truthful claims about things, which unfortunately is not the case. So pseudoscience is this idea that people use the concept of science to help support their claims to truth, even when they're not using science. And I think we're very much exposed to pseudoscience these days, and we really need to be careful. So characteristics of pseudoscience that we need to watch out for. One is that the hypotheses generated are not typically testable, so it's very hard to prove a pseudoscientific hypothesis wrong or right. So we can kind of think about, all these different examples that I list later. So do essential oils treat cancer, right? There's a lot of informal anecdotal evidence that comes to support these pseudoscientific claims. So my sister-in-law, she had a specific kind of breast cancer, and she purchased the essential oils that I was selling, and lo and behold, she was cured of her cancer. So you should definitely buy my essential oils. So these kinds of anecdotal forms of evidence are very common in pseudoscience because there's really no studies. There's no what we call randomized controlled trials or experiments that look at an association between essential oils and cancer, because the research never gets to that point, because there's no evidence to support an association between these when we're using real scientific methods. So we never end up having a study that supports this association. Also, if scientific tests are reported, oftentimes the methodology is not scientific. Sometimes the data can be just sort of, manufactured fake data kinds of things. We just really need to be careful when we're allowing somebody to use science to help support their claims. Other examples of this are like fad diets. So we can think of something like, the paleo diet. So I actually work quite a bit with our nutrition department, and I think dieting behavior is extremely interesting, and I think it's important to have some kind of dietary program as well, because we're just surrounded by cheap, high calorie, high sugar, high fat kinds of foods that if we didn't think about our diet, we would probably easily become unhealthy because of that. So it's important to think about diet, but there's so many companies out there that are trying to sell us a new diet. There's so many fad diets, but I think the paleo diet is one of those where, I think maybe an example being bulletproof coffee. That's something that's maybe more related to the keto diet, but we have this company that sells bulletproof coffee that they support this claim that drinking bulletproof coffee, which if you haven't heard of it is basically coffee with butter in the morning, is going to increase your metabolism, reduce hunger throughout the day, and all of these things, even though they don't have strong evidence that this is true. But they sell their product based upon these kinds of claims, which they're not supported by the Food and Drug Administration. There's not really any kind of scientific body that supports their claims, so they can just kind of say whatever they want. Also, like the supplement market, so if you've heard of things like even protein drinks, but things like creatine, all sorts of different amino acids and those kinds of things, a lot of companies try to sell their product based upon claims that these different sorts of amino acids or different kinds of components actually influence health, although there's really not evidence that it happens. So really we have to be very careful around pseudoscience. And I think what we need to do to combat pseudoscience and to protect ourselves is to demand, evidence-based science. What this means is that evidence-based science is science that has really kind of gone through the process of being falsified, of peer review, where there's multiple, sometimes hundreds of studies done on the same research question, potentially using different research methods, and most of the time using different research methods. But they all support the same conclusion, and this is what evidence-based science is. If you go into the healthcare field, evidence-based decision-making is extremely popular and important right now, because oftentimes doctors previously used intuition to treat different kinds of maladies. This resulted in all kinds of misdiagnoses, kinds of issues where they're actually doing more harm than good. So now a lot of healthcare and insurance companies force doctors to use evidence-based medicine, which is making decisions based upon literature reviews, looking at science, talking with other scientists, rather than just sort of shooting from the hip and making a decision. So that's what I think the cure to pseudoscience is demanding evidence-based science. Now we'd like to spend some time talking about why we do science and the different goals of science and how these are related to one another. This really is a process, so these goals of science you could kind of think of as just a set of steps in completing science or maybe answering a specific research question, where what we do first is we talk about description of behavior, and where this starts is, excuse me, like really observation and that empirical perspective, where the thing that we want to do first is collect data or make observations and collect information and really kind of understand whatever process or research question we're interested in, see how it operates in different settings, in different conditions, maybe at different times, and that sort of thing. So really describe and do a deep description of the research question itself. And if the research question hasn't been asked before, so if you're looking at something kind of new and interesting, you always have to start with description. So more novel, new research questions, they always start with a description of behavior. After the behavior is described, or after the process is described, the next step would be to predict behavior. So what are the different variables, the different conditions, the different exposures that predict a specific behavior? So let's talk about an example of potentially we have, so we're interested in studying adolescent depression, and we, in our free time, we do yoga. So we come up with this idea based upon kind of our intuition and maybe personal experience that doing yoga would be an effective means of reducing depression. So what we could then do is create, a research program that looks at the relationship between doing yoga and depression in adolescents. So the first thing we would need to do is describe the behavior. So describe yoga in an adolescent population, describe depression in an adolescent population, and then describe how these are related with one another. Then we would want to go on to use this predictive framework where we're interested in whether doing yoga predicts depression. So if we had one set of teens do yoga and then measure their depression levels, and had another group of teens not do yoga and measure their depression levels, would the depression levels of those adolescents be different? So this would allow us to start to anticipate events. So the event of depression, which would be our outcome variable, would be predicted by our predictor variable, which would be yoga in this case. So once we established that there was a relationship between yoga and depression, we would then need to go on to another level of sophistication and determine whether there is a causal association between yoga and depression. Identifying a causal association, and you can kind of think of this as one thing causes the other, is very difficult in social sciences. Let me show you this next slide that contains all of the necessary conditions of determining causality. So the first condition in determining a causal relationship is temporal precedence, meaning that the predictor variable comes in time before the outcome variable. So you can imagine that temporal precedence in our example of yoga and depression would mean that the teens actually participating in yoga would need to come in time before their change in depression. And I think this is just sort of a logical kind of thing, where if we think one thing predicts the other, the cause needs to precede the effect in time, is how our textbook puts it. So that's fairly, I think, straightforward in terms of thinking about that. The next would actually be determining that there's a relationship. So thinking about covariation of the cause and effect. So in this case, when we expose teens to yoga, and that's kind of a fancy way of saying we have teens participate in a yoga program, we would expect a decrease in depression or lower levels of depression amongst teens who do yoga. Amongst those teens who don't do yoga, who don't participate, we would expect higher levels of depression. So this would be a proof of covariation of cause and effect, right? So when the yoga is present, depression is lower. When yoga is not present, depression is higher. So I think both the condition of temporal precedence and covariation of cause and effect is really pretty straightforward. The next condition is actually much more difficult and much more common as a problem in determining causality, and that's eliminating alternative explanations. So in this example of adolescent yoga and depression, there's all sorts of things that could predict both whether a teen does yoga and their levels of depression, right? So imagine that we think about parental education. So this is a common measure of socioeconomic status. So a socioeconomic status is this idea of a bunch of intangible resources like education, income, monetary assets, even social support sometimes. These things that allow people to make better decisions and make better choices. So imagine that the group of teens who are doing yoga, their parents have higher education than the group of teens who are not doing yoga. This would be an alternative explanation because teens with families from higher socioeconomic backgrounds likely have lower depression because they've been exposed to lower stress across their life. They have probably more autonomy. They have more agency, and that they feel that they can make decisions that will, positively affect them and that kind of thing. So this variable, what we will call a confounding variable in parental education, is something that really would make the relationship between yoga and depression look like there's a meaningful association, but actually it's parental SES and parental education working in the background. So the removal of alternative explanations is very difficult in social science, and we'll end up spending a lot of time talking about experimental designs, which are really one of the only true ways of removing all possible alternative explanations from a research question. So once we've determined a causal association between a predictor variable and an outcome, what we want to do is actually identify the mechanism of how this relationship works, or why this relationship works. So imagine that we ruled out all alternative explanations, and we know that there's a causal association between yoga and depression in adolescence. Now we need to understand why there's a relationship. So potentially it could be kind of a biological sort of thing where just by doing 30 or 60 minutes of yoga exercise, we reduce maybe our stress hormones, so something like our cortisol levels decrease, and that might be one of the mechanisms through which yoga influences depression. It may also be that teens are making friends at the yoga studio, so they're being exposed to more people that have maybe positive dispositions and have good attitudes and stuff. And this exposure is what's actually decreasing depression. It's not so much the yoga, it's the social environment in which they're doing yoga. So this is another difficult task, because really identifying why one thing causes the other thing to change is really quite difficult, and especially in social science, because social relationships are just so complex that there's so many different possible variables, so many different possible mechanisms that would describe the relationship between one thing and the other. And finally, I think we can kind of end this discussion on this idea of really the broad overarching goal of science is to reduce ambiguity. So to reduce our lack of knowledge and our lack of understanding of different kinds of behaviors and relationships, and this is why we do science. And I've talked a little bit about sort of the Enlightenment period, like the Renaissance, when people started using science to kind of better our lives through asking questions about how we can have better public health, how we can apply different kinds of physical forces to do work for us, and those kinds of things. And this was, generally this reduction of ambiguity. We're gaining mastery of our environment and the tools around us. And really, science allows us to do that. So when we think about why we're doing science, I think it's a good thing to always think back on this fact that we're doing it because we want to answer questions. We want to know more, and therefore not understand less. It's kind of an awkward way to say that, but hopefully you get where I'm going. So one other thing we want to talk about before we finish up is the difference between basic and applied research. Basic and applied research, again, very much overlapping with one another, and I'll talk about this concept of a continuum just before we finish. But there's really two distinct types of research, basic and applied research. So basic research is research that attempts to answer these kinds of fundamental questions about relationships and the nature of behaviors and outcomes. I think a good way to remember basic research is think of like an old gray-haired professor who's, very just unkept and spends maybe 16 hours of their day in the laboratory looking at, maybe small genetic variations between mice and how that is related to, anxiety or stress or those kinds of things. Laboratory research is a great way to just remember what basic research is, the kind of research that gets done in a laboratory. But these are really very specific theoretical issues, talking about complexities of life and emotion, and really trying to boil a relationship down to its essence, right? So removing all of those alternative explanations and saying what is the true relationship between variable X and variable Y. This is very common of research done at universities. So, some of the research that my colleagues do, not so much myself. Actually, maybe I do quite a bit of basic research because I'm interested in conceptual, theoretical kinds of things. But a lot of the work that's done at a university could be defined as basic research. Really, to understand what basic research is, you kind of have to set up a comparison. And I think, that's helpful to think about this. So applied research is that comparison. So applied research is the research that gets done in industry, in government, in business. And really applied research is thinking about applying research methods to a specific practical problem or question that affects a population. Thinking about program evaluation, so we talked about a Meals on Wheels program, or different kinds of social programs that help reduce poverty or income inequality and those kinds of things. Program evaluation is really a really important way to approach applied research, because evaluating whether a program is effective is really the only way to say if the money was spent well, if the people in the program were actually served or benefited from the intervention. So that's really important, So I'll talk a lot about program evaluation because I think it's really important. It's a good example of the different kinds of research methods we talk about in this course. But also I think it's something you could think about as a meaningful career choice in the future as well, because there's all sorts of different kinds of programs that need evaluation. Getting outside of this sort of social science that I'm embedded in, you can think of applied research even from an engineering perspective. So let's say that you're somebody that builds bridges. So I actually have quite a few friends that either are actual bridge designers, or maybe they work in concrete manufacturing or development to identify what kind of strength is needed and weight in concrete to build bridges and that kind of thing. But that's a very applied issue, is how do we develop a material that's light enough to span a very long bridge, but it's also strong enough to last a long time. It's also flexible enough to not crack. Those are all applied research questions, and the kind of research that's being done by maybe the Texas Department of Transportation, different kinds of laboratories in our engineering schools and programs. This can be very applied research, so that's meaningful. So that's just before we end. I wanted to talk about how, and let me see if this is the last slide. This is the last slide. Is how applied and basic research are related to one another. Because again, these things aren't separate. There's a lot of overlap between them. So we don't really consider one superior to the other. Applied research really relies a lot on basic research, right? So somebody out in the field building bridges, they actually have to rely on a scientist that works in a laboratory that's maybe some sort of molecular engineer, biologist that works with these different kinds of synthetic materials. So they have to rely on that basic research to actually get their research done. Also, the people that are working in the laboratories, their work really wouldn't be valuable unless somebody was applying it in a practical, meaningful way. So there's a lot of, it's a kind of conversation between basic and applied research that occurs. And they should really be viewed as a continuum rather than as a distinct set of categories. So I use this concept a lot, and this allows me to also draw a little bit, so I enjoy that. So thinking about what a continuum is as compared to like a dichotomy. So let me open up my Microsoft Word here. Here we go. And I wanted to show you what a continuum is. So you can imagine that we have basic research. So we have basic research equals 0, and applied equals 1. So in this sense, what we're looking at is a dichotomy. So these are so common in everyday thought and practice because it's so easy to think of things as either one thing or the other, right? So it's either black or white. Thinking about our political spectrum here in the United States, we have either conservatives or liberals, and we don't talk a lot about the people that are in between. I think what happens a lot is we come up with this idea of what's called a false dichotomy. So we actually think that there's these two categories when in fact there's a lot of overlap between them. It's much more complex than just having two categories. And a way to conceptualize that is a continuum. So if we have a continuum, imagine that we have, a 0 at one end, and then we have a 1 on the other end, and we have a line in between them. So on this continuum, we have, think about basic and applied research, right? So we have somebody that is doing mostly basic research, but they also have some applied elements to their research. Then we have another person over here that does mostly applied research, but some of their research is related to kind of basic conceptual research as well. So that's important for research methods, but I think it's what I'm trying to get at. It's also really important to think about when we're talking about who we think we are, what we like, what political affiliation we have, what we think about important topics like gun control and those kinds of things. So it's very easy for us to put ourselves in either one of the two categories. I'm either a conservative or I'm a liberal. When in actuality, the truth is, and even though it's more difficult to explain, the truth really is that most people fall somewhere in the middle here, right? So think about, maybe yourself, your partners, your parents, and how they think politically. Most of the time, they fall somewhere in between these two poles, and you can kind of think of these as like poles, right? Like the North Pole and the South Pole. So usually they fall somewhere in between these. Oftentimes this sort of nuance gets lost when we're using, where we're either having a debate, so we're getting emotional and it's much easier to talk about being one way or the other. We forget that there's a lot of overlap, a lot of ambiguity in those kinds of things. I know that it happens in my family where if I'm just looking at what a family member posted on Facebook about their political opinions, it's much easier for me to classify them as completely one or the other, right? So that person's either completely conservative over here or completely liberal. There's a line in the sand and it's drawn. When I talk to that person in person and we start to have kind of a reasonable adult conversation about these things, we end up finding that that person is this, somewhere right in between them. And, maybe they lean more on the conservative side, but also they have a lot of opinions that could be characteristic of a liberal as well. So, I kind of like talking about these philosophical things a little bit because I think they're really important for you to develop your sense of who you are and really kind of how to think in our complex, world and society and that kind of thing. So I really hope I can help foster conversations around this kind of stuff. Hopefully it adds a little bit of interest to what's, a lot of times a dry subject in research methods. But I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to your questions. Make sure that you're posting all of your questions and comments on the forums. That's why we're there. Or I guess that's why they are there. So I really want you to be, active and if you have questions about the concepts that we covered today, I want to hear those. If you have questions or comments about this idea of a continuum versus a dichotomy, I'd really like to hear those. And, I think it's expected that I hear those because it's important for you to communicate with me and to communicate with other students, especially in this online course. We really have to make the point that we're going to talk to each other and we're going to kind of reflect on each other's ideas. So please do that. It's been a pleasure, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.